We're going to tackle 5th grade social studies today for the week of May 11th. I'm going to read the chapter that we're supposed to read, and then I will help you get the words done as well. Okay, so we're going to look at the picture up here. Before the mid-1950s, many African American students and white students attended separate schools. We're talking about civil rights. Thelma Williams grew up in the South before World War II. It was a time and place where African Americans and white Americans were kept separate in many ways. There were these hard separation lines that you simply did not cross, Miss Williams remembered. In the post-war years, those lines of separation were strong, but they were about to weaken. A long history of segregation. The United States Constitution guarantees civil rights to free Americans of all races. Civil rights are basic freedoms and protections such as the right to a fair trial. In the late 1800s, African Americans were being denied their civil rights. This was especially true in the South. In 1896, the Supreme Court judged a now famous legal case, Plessy versus Ferguson. It said that separation of races in public places was legal if the facilities, though separate, were equal. This ruling made racial segregation or separation legal. So here we have a drinking fountain, white and colored. Laws that separated black and white Americans were called Jim Crow laws. Segregated facilities like drinking fountains were common before civil rights reform. Look at the map. It shows where segregation was required or allowed by 1952. Even in places where segregation was not the law, African Americans often faced discrimination or the unfair treatment of people based on race or gender. African Americans built strong communities across the nation. They ran successful businesses. There were African American colleges, clubs, and theaters. African American scientists, entertainers, and authors were famous for their achievements. Nonetheless, segregation isolated African Americans. In reality, separate but equal did not work. So here is a map of segregation in 1952 in the United States. The orange colors, where we are, Texas, they were segregation was required by law. These yellow here, segregation was allowed. Purple, segregation prohibited by law. And then the green was no specific local or state laws about segregation. So it's very similar to when the Civil War happened. Like we had the South that had the slaves and the North where there were free people. Okay? So not a lot changed up until now. We're going to learn more. On April 15, 1947, Jack Roosevelt Robinson stepped into the field at Dodger Stadium in Brooklyn, New York. It was a historic moment. African Americans had played in their own Negro League since the late 1800s. No African Americans had been allowed to play in Major League Baseball. Dodgers manager Branch Rickey hired Jackie Robinson from the Negro League. Robinson was a brave and outstanding player, and he now broke the color barrier. However, he still faced terrible racism from white players and fans. And that's a picture of him. A year later, President Harry Truman issued an executive order. He stated that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. The United States Armed Services were officially no longer segregated. Like Robinson, other African Americans were also breaking down the color barrier. In 1950, Ralph Bunche became the first African American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. In that same year, Gwendolyn Brooks became the first African American poet to win the Pulitzer Prize. Meanwhile, something larger was going on. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was planning to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. So down here you have the main idea and supporting details of what was read here. Let's see if that's part of what your assignment is. I know the answer the questions. Yes, so you definitely want to go through and answer these questions. If you don't have a book, we will go through those questions at the end of this lesson. So if you do have a book, you can answer them in your book. Otherwise, we will do those on paper. Ending school segregation. In the early 1950s, the NAACP asked for legal trials in Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. All the trials claimed that separate education was not equal education. Eventually, these court cases went to the Supreme Court. Together, they were called Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Topeka is a community in Kansas. The lawyer for the NAACP was the gifted Thurgood Marshall. Marshall spent his career fighting segregation, arguing 32 cases before the Supreme Court and winning 29 of them. At the center of the Brown case was a young girl named Linda Brown. She lived in Topeka and went to an all-African American school far from her house. Why couldn't Linda go to the all-white school close to home? In 1954, the Supreme Court agreed that she could. It said that separate educational facilities are inherently basically unequal. This decision changed the American life. It would be years before integration or mixing of different groups came to all American schools, but the Brown decision had improved civil rights for millions of African Americans. So right here, a mother and daughter stood on the steps of the Supreme Court building after the Brown decision. Explain how that decision was similar to Jackie Robinson joining the Major Leagues. So we're going to work on that later. The Montgomery bus boycott. Here's Rosa Parks. We're going to learn about her. In the 1950s, Montgomery, Alabama was one of the most segregated cities in the nation. However, the movement for change would come to Montgomery too. A woman named Rosa Parks was in the local NAACP. Parks challenged one of the Montgomery Jim Crow laws. The law said that African Americans had to sit in the back of the public buses. On December 1st, 1955, Parks refused to move to the back of the bus. She was jailed for it. In response, African Americans in Montgomery organized a boycott of city buses. A majority of Montgomery's bus riders were African American. In the end, the bus company was forced to give in and let everyone sit where they wished on the city buses or go out of business. The boycott's leader was a 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. "We have no alternative but to protest," King said. He understood that the African American community could no longer be patient with anything less than freedom and justice. Peaceful but powerful protests like the Montgomery bus boycott were at the heart of King's belief in nonviolence. He urged peaceful resistance to injustice, not violence. Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon, he said. It is a sword that heals. Martin Luther King Jr. shaped the nation's civil rights movement with this belief in nonviolence. Protests spread. Over the next 10 years, the strength of the civil rights movement grew. School integration began slowly, however. Arkansas was one of the few states to start integrating schools. In September 1957, 9 African American students were ready to integrate Central High School in the city of Little Rock. But the governor of Arkansas refused to let them begin classes. Violence erupted. Finally, President Eisenhower sent 1,000 United States Army soldiers to Little Rock. They were ordered to protect the Little Rock Nine at school. Here is a Little Rock Nine, a picture of them trying to go to school, the Army protecting them. Meanwhile, African Americans and white supporters tried to integrate other public places. In 1960, 4 African American college students in North Carolina staged the first sit-in. They sat quietly at a whites-only lunch counter. The manager asked them to leave, but they refused. Soon, sit-ins were happening in cities across the South. Nonviolence was sometimes met with violence. In the summer of 1961, 13 civil rights protesters went on the first Freedom Ride. On Freedom Rides, African American and white protesters rode buses together to integrate bus lines. The Freedom Riders were often in danger from those who did not want segregation to end. Rider John Lewis was 21 years old that summer. He remembered the violence. "I thought I was going to die," he said after his bus was burned and he was beaten. Still, the protests continued. Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963, children and adults, including Martin Luther King Jr., marched and went to jail to protest segregation. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth was a leader of the African American community in Birmingham. To bring about change, he said, you might have to suffer for what you believe in. That's what the movement is all about. New civil rights laws. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. He called the crowd of more than 200,000 people in front of him the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. In the most famous part of his speech, "I have a dream," King said that day, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." In March 1965, King led protests in Selma, Alabama to demand voting rights. Protesters marched from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. The protesters were met with tear gas and beatings. The event, known as Bloody Sunday, was televised. People from around the world were angered by this treatment of peaceful marchers. Just a few months later, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. When he signed it, President Lyndon Johnson called it one of the most monumental laws in the entire history of American freedom. The victories of the 1960s were powerful, but tragedy struck when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. Today, his birthday, January 15th, is a national holiday. And then we have a question here, and we'll revisit that in a bit. The movement continues. Strengthened by the civil rights movement, African Americans achieved new successes. Thurgood Marshall became the first African American justice on the United States Supreme Court in 1967. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm was the first African American woman elected to Congress. Mae Jemison became the first African American female astronaut to reach space in 1992. The list of achievements goes on and on. In 2008, Americans elected the first African American president, Barack Obama. Obama spoke in Selma before his election. Honoring the civil rights movement, he told the crowd, "I'm here because somebody marched." That was very interesting. So now we're going to go and we're going to define the vocabulary words. Let's see. And all the definitions are going to be found within the writing. But I'm going to go ahead and help you with it, because I'm a nerd and I really like to do stuff. So, oops, moved my phone. I got excited there and moved my phone all around. Okay, so I'm just going to get me some paper. Okay. Paper, here we go. Alright, so when you do this, if you're going to do it on paper, which there is a little bit of room in your book, but not really enough. So you want to make sure you put your name. I'm putting mine, Miss Bliss. I'm going to put May 11th, Social Studies. If you know your teacher's name, that's even better. Everything you turn in needs to have your name on it. I'm just going to keep saying that all the time. I'm going to put 5th grade because I do both. Okay. So our first word is civil rights. I'm going to change my color for the word and the definition because I can, and I like it. Alright, they're the basic freedoms. And I bought some new pens today, so I'm pretty excited. So I won't run out. And protections. Such as the right to a fair trial. Okay, good, we got that one. Now we're going to do number 2. The next word is discrimination. And that's unfair treatment of people based on race or gender. That also goes further. In our lesson, we're only going to do this definition, but in the real world, it also includes like ethnicity, like where they're from, or religion, things like that. So, you know, there's more to it. Okay, flip the page. We've got integration is next. That's the mixing of different groups. Okay, next one. Remember, you can pause, rewind, stop it, whatever you need to do so that you can catch up. Okay, we're going to do the sit-in. That was the next one. That's, well, in this particular one, this sit-in was at a lunch counter, but it could be anywhere where people go somewhere. Hi, babe. They aren't allowed. And refuse to leave. Okay, so that's a sit-in. And now we're going to do freedom rides. You could do it over there because you're just copying. African American and white protesters rode buses together to integrate bus lines.
To do whatever first.
It's all there. Okay, those are the freedom rides. Oh, and that was all of the definitions. You just need to copy it. Right here. Yep, just copy. Alright, so that was your vocabulary. So I'm just going to write on the top vocabulary. Right there. Alright, now we're going to go and we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do the questions. I'm going to put my name. Every piece. I'm going to put May 11th. I'm going to abbreviate social studies, 5th grade. And then I'm just going to put questions. Alright, so I'm going to go back to question number 1. Alright, it said analyze the map. It said circle states where segregation was outlawed. So I'm just going to write those states, which is good, even better. And then if you need to circle it, you can just circle it. So I'm going to go to number 1. And I'm just going to briefly write what I'm doing. Segregation outlawed. So that means they don't allow it. So let's see where that happened. Okay. So this will serve as notes also so that you can remember things. Okay, so it was prohibited by law by the purple color. And so that was Washington. Washington State, not Washington, D.C. Idaho. Colorado. Minnesota. Iowa. Wisconsin. Illinois. Michigan. Indiana. Ohio. Pennsylvania. New York. Maine. Make sure. Maine, Rhode Island. Okay, Maine. Rhode Island. Quite a few, more than I thought. Connecticut. Connecticut. I'm not sure I spelled that right. New Jersey. Delaware, Maryland, they look like they're not. Okay, so those are your states. That's where they were, it was actually outlawed, so they didn't have segregation. So that's a good thing. All right. Next is number 2, and it was a color barrier chart. So I'm gonna draw the chart and fill it in, and you can just do it on your book if you have it. If you don't, then of course you want to do this. So I'm going to do the color barrier. And then the top box is the main idea. And if you'll notice, the subtitle for that page on page 668 is breaking the color barrier. So everything we're going to need is going to be in that section. So people worked to break the color barrier. And I overlapped, that's okay. So now I'm going to do my supporting details. They gave us one. And if you're doing it in the book, you don't even have to write this because it's already there.